We're we're going live.
Oh, are we?
So I just had a question from Alexis who was like, "Can I have the Zoom link to join?" And I'm like, "Just join and chat and say what you can." Hope that was the right answer.
Yes.
I'm going to try to close Facebook so it doesn't make sounds while we're doing this.
Okay. Well, and it looks like we are live, so we'll say hello really quickly. And don't worry, we're totally not ironing things out on the fly, because why would we do that?
Oh, we are live. Hello. Does that mean that people are watching us?
Yes, actually.
Oh yes.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us on a Sunday morning. Shall I start my intro now?
Let's give it a few minutes for everybody to finish getting in. And if anybody needs to grab a water or anything fun like that. You were talking about your setup. What you can't see is that I am trapped on my couch behind multiple small tables. Well, I'm looking forward to this. Oh, and it looks like other people are as well. I can see in the chat we have some people who are excited. So, yeah.
Cool. Yeah, because I just see the private chat, so you're going to be seeing the rest of that.
Oh, yes.
Oh, there it is. I see it pops up there. Nicely.
So for Baroness Spike and I, this is our first time getting to do things within. Oh, see that Clovis is posting comments. This is our first time working within StreamYard as presenters, so it's a small learning curve. Clovis has worked in it for doing some of the ethereal court stuff for Kingdom. It's gonna be a lot of fun. Oh wow. I see lots of names of people I know.
Hi, Rose. Hi, Rifkin.
The fun part is going to be every time I go to mute my mic, my hammer's going to go blip, 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 but you know, it's all part of our charm.
It gives us some movement to look at, right?
That's right. Although it does remind me of the TikTok meme of the video da 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 da. But hello, Win. This is kind of fun. I'm enjoying the multiple stream of comments that I can actually view. This is a definite plus to the Zoom. So, all right. So it looks like we are 2 minutes at, and yeah, I guess if you are ready.
Sure. So start out with saying hi and explaining who I am and how the class is going to run and why I'm offering this class. So my modern name is Maddie Dumont. My SCA name is Spike Zoetart. I'm a Baroness of the Court and a companion of the Order of the Laurel. I was not recognized specifically for my costuming. I was recognized probably more for my pewtering, but I do dress myself and my friends and partner well. And I am the daughter of a professional seamstress who only retired a few years ago. And so I grew up sewing and doing things with my hands. And I am an upholsterer in my modern job. I've had my own business as an upholsterer for almost 19 years. So I work with my hands and my tools a lot. And you'll hear me say what I use in the workroom or what I use professionally or at work. That's what I'm referring to. I understand that most people don't. However, I have also the shared perspective that because I work with my hands, I come home from work with tired hands and I don't do a ton of hand sewing. I would like to get clothes done and get them made. So how this class is going to work, as you know, there's a chat stream and we absolutely welcome your comments and questions in chat. However, I have a lot to cover, so we're not going to do a lot of other people's ideas and suggestions jumping in here. I have a couple people that I have asked as professional ringers to comment in if they have something to add because they've worked in costuming and clothing craft professions. I absolutely am willing to do a follow-up workshop class or classes where we can meet and do things hand-on or where people can collaborate and share their different ideas because there's a lot I don't know that other people have to offer. But this isn't going to be the format for everybody offering today.
So really quickly, Spike, can you remind us of who the ringers are so we remember when we're looking at the chat stream?
that will be Mistress Anissa, who is Alexis Garrigue, and Taryn Destringer.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much.
So those are the Mistress turn also. So they're both also companions of the Order of the Laurel, but they both worked in professions with professional sewing, and so that's also why I asked them for their contributions. And I also want to thank the people who were my test audience yesterday, who were really awesome and gave me a lot of good suggestions as well. Thanks to those folks. So we can move forward on the card.
Sure.
Sewing since before I learned to read. My mom, there she is, taught me to sew and continues to teach me to sew. She also did a few brilliant things that I want to share as teaching somebody younger to sew and having patience with them. She would not do my work for me, but she would take it out when I made mistakes. So when I was in 6th grade and entered black pants with white piping up the side in a 4-H competition, which I got a big ribbon for, I did them 5 times before I got the piping right. She didn't sew the piping, but she did remove them 4 times for me. She also really bit her lip till it bled and didn't criticize the quick and dirty sewing that I did in college, and waited till I developed into a real professional who makes good clothing and now praises and compliments me. And she put me in front of a sewing machine. That's actually the second sewing machine I was learning to sew on at age 5 there. And there I am showing my early bent towards dressing up and being medieval. Yes, it is good to make garb with machines. Obviously, our historic personas that we recreate, everything was made by hand. It was an incredible amount of their resources. They spent all of their time growing food, storing food, preserving food, growing fibers, harvesting fibers, creating cloth, creating clothing. We have modern lives to lead. It is not practical for most of us to weave our own fabric and hand sew it together. There is so much that you can and should learn by making things by hand. However, it is completely okay to just want to have clothes that look good and go out there and wear them and do other things. So that's my central mission is it's okay to make things by machine. What I try to focus on with my handwork is to finish my necklines and my cuffs by hand or in a way that the machine sewing doesn't show, because those are the principal areas that people interact with, and that's where it's really going to show. So try not to use the machine top stitching where it shows, but by all means, our hems dragging the ground, doing all that by hand isn't the best equation of our time to energy. So I'm here to teach you some other good ways to use your time and energy. Books. These are 2 books that my mom recommended, and I was really appreciated. The Claire Schaefer's Fabric Sewing Guide tells you how to sew every kind of fabric. In the SCA, we tend to limit to linen, silk, wool, and cotton. There are a lot of other fibers in the world. There's a lot of information about how to weave, deal with different weaves and different drapes of fabric. Really useful if you're diving deep into wanting that knowledge. It's still in print. You can still, on Amazon, just put the ISBN number in and the book will come right up, which is really faster than searching other methods. The whole sewing catalog is not still in print, which is why I went ahead and used some of their photographs for this class. But it was actually a pretty awesome thing, and it's still available in used form. It was made by Consumer Reports, and it is a lot like my class in that it is a sort of basic sewing instruction set where every couple pages they have a picture of, and here's the product you could use for this, and the product name and information. And a lot of those products are still available. So the whole sewing catalog is actually a pretty useful reference. If you just wish you had somebody that you could just go back and look at their instructions, recommend that one. Okay. So how I'm going to lay this out is kind of the life stream of making a garment, starting with we acquire fabric and so forth. So buying fabric. When you buy fabric, a lot of us are buying it online because that is where we can affordably find natural fibers. It is really important to get samples of fabric before you purchase. If you have to, that sometimes means buying a yard before you buy 6 or 8 yards, but knowing the feel and the weight and how that's going to look, it's going to look different in different light. If you're looking at it in a store and you're not sure what it's going to look like in daylight, ask to take a sample outside. It makes a big difference. So check out your samples before you buy your fabric. Aline, Baroness of Wywood, also a companion of the Order of the Laurel and enabler extraordinaire, has offered her Google document of online fabric merchants, which is super useful. Obviously, all this data will be available after the class as well. highly recommend that link for a lot of great places to buy your fabric online. Fitting muslins. It is also useful when you're buying fabric to have, I put it around the corner and now I can see it, there it is. Muslins. You might use old sheets, you might use old fabric, but the honest answer is use your 50% off coupon or sale, buy a whole bolt of it at Joann's, then you always have a bunch of muslin around for doing your fitting muslins. Just, my mind, entirely worth the money. Have it on hand, and then every time I am sewing, I have something I can use. Once you have that fabric, it's going to be really important that you pre-wash it. Pre-washing fabric does not just affect how you're going to wash it later, although that is a big factor. Fibers shrink, fibers change. Sometimes they stretch out when they have been washed. There is not just fiber shrinkage, there's also mill shrinkage. When fabric is woven, it is stretched tight on frames in the factory. Sometimes it is treated with sizing to help keep it stretched out to that. When you wash it, those fibers move and they change where they are in the garment and in the fabric. That is why you really, really, really should pre-wash your fabric. I pre-wash all my fabric, and I tend to pre-wash things machine wash warm and, if possible, tumble dry. I don't wash my garments that way later, except for the white linen that I am trying to break down to make it softer. All the colored garments, I'm later going to wash them cold on gentle and line dry them. But you want to try to get all the shrinkage and changes and dye loss and sizing out first thing. So really, really highly encourage you to pre-wash your fabric. Before you do that, it's a really good idea to finish the raw edge so that those extra threads don't tangle up and create a ball in your washing machine and dryer. Sergers are the type of sewing machine that sews an overcast, that is, the edge bound over with a set of loops and stitches. We see serging stitching on the inside of a lot of our modern garments. Most modern sewing is finished that way. Sergers are a different kind of sewing machine. Some of us have them. Talk to amongst your friends. A lot of times somebody has one that you can borrow or come over and use. But if you don't have a serger, the odds are pretty good that you have an overcast foot in your sewing machine box. So take a look. This is a close-up of the one for my machine. What it looks a little bit like a zipper foot, but it has this little bar on the side. That enables you to use a zigzag foot, and it keeps that zigzag pulled over that edge instead of just pulling the fabric in tightly, because it rides down that bar instead of sucking back in really tightly. It's a handy way to overcast your edge. If you don't have an overcast foot, you might find that you want to just flip the edge of the fabric over and zigzag it down. That'll help secure it. You'll lose about a ½ inch of your fabric, but it's still really useful to prevent the fraying, which can lose you a lot more fabric. Another tip from Fiorleaf was that if you're pre-washing 4 yards or less, particularly in linen, it works real well to sew the ends together into a seam, so you have a great big tube, and wash that. But she said she found that it doesn't form as tight of balls, and you don't get those really hard creases in your washing and drying that you get more often when the fabric balls up really tightly in the dryer. Okay, so that's preparing your fabric. We've talked about it being washed. Now I'm going to talk about ironing and pressing. Ironing is extremely important. It's extremely important before you work on your fabric to press it out, to stretch the fibers back out into place and to lay them flat. Because if you lay your pattern down on a piece of fabric that's not ironed and cut around, that extra bulge from that wrinkle means you got an extra bulge in that piece of fabric. You don't want that. Also, I actually think it's really important to iron our fabric before we wear it as well. It makes everything lay nicer, drape nicer, feel better. Even when I'm going to be putting my gown into a duffel bag or a box to take it to events, ironing it when it's done being washed and dried makes a big difference in how it feels and how it wears. To that end, I recommend buying the best ironing board you possibly can. I'm a big ironing fan and I do a lot of it, so I bought a really expensive, really nice ironing board. Zero regrets. I included a link to it in the list. I'm not sure if it's up, but that's okay. I recommend it highly. You can check it out in the list later. It's big. Over-the-door storage racks are a good way to find a place to store one. Mine's against my back door. I do have to slightly open it to fit it onto the over-the-door storage rack because it's that big of an ironing board. completely worth it. So press your fabric. That matters a lot. The next question is, how are you going to store your fabric? The best way to store your fabric, once it's been pressed, to not create any new creases, is to put it on a roll. Not all of us have room for rolls. Not all of us have access to them. The places to find them are fabric stores and upholstery shops, because most of our fabric comes stored on rolls, comes shipped that way. We use it up. We end up with extra rolls. Keep them around. Equestrians use them for jousting, but they use a special kind. They don't just steal them from our fabric department. Once you have the fabric on a roll, some people do store those rolls upright, like in a corner or a closet. And that's pretty convenient. It's not the worst idea, especially with something like linen. However, fabric stored on the roll can slide down and create ripples at the bottom that don't always press out, especially if it's a delicate fabric or anything with a nap like velvet. Do not store it on end. If at all possible, store it flat. So this picture is my workroom, my upholstery workroom. So you can see my cardboard rolls in the corner there, and you can see how the fabric is stored on rolls underneath the table. This is a gloriously huge table. It is 8 feet by 5 feet plus. I built it myself. It is built really strongly because sometimes I have to climb on top of it. I can't close that window blind without doing so. And there's room for a lot of storage underneath it. Most of us don't have room for that. So this is if you have a whole garage to take over as your showing room option for you. If you don't, underneath a couch or underneath a bed are often places where you have room to store a whole roll. It's a great way to store your fabric. If you can't, you store it flat, you fold it as little as possible. So the larger folds will help. There'll just be fewer creases for you to press out later. And if you stored it flat and you're laying it out to press it or to cut it out for a garment, you might want to press those creases out again. Okay. The other thing that this picture shows is a couple spring clamps. When you're laying your fabric out on your cutting table, there is certainly the challenge of the fabric wanting to slide off, especially when there's extra yards of it that aren't fitting on the table. And I find that cheap little spring clamps are a great way for me to hold the fabric in place. Obviously, you do want them to be cleaner than maybe the ones in your garage and wood shop projects are. So you do wash them or potentially put some blue tape or something on them to make sure that they're not marking up your fabric when you're using them, or keep them just workroom clean if that's what they're for. They're not real expensive. Other people use weights, sometimes even just like weighted bean bags or like boxes, lead weights, to help hold their fabric in place on the table. As you're looking at your fabric and processing it, you might find that you have slubs and snags in the fabric. There are some tricky ways to repair that are worth doing. One of them is this Snag Nabbit tool. It costs less than $3 because that's what I'm charging my clients for them. And it used to be called the Snag Repair Tool, obviously. I have 2 packages of them. This is a very difficult thing to photograph because it's basically a needle. And instead of the eye at the end of the needle, it's got knurled threads. What you do is you put it in right where the thread is coming out of the fabric, and you get those threads wrapped around that knurled part and pull the needle through, and those extra threads pull through to the back. This is a tool I use a lot with commercial upholstery fabric. I use it less commonly with garb making fabric, but it is useful to know it exists. Very fine, sharp crochet hooks will sometimes do the same thing, but I do find that the Snag Nabbit will grab a little more of loose fibers and pull them through. When you find a flaw like that, it's a good idea to mark it so that you are working around that and trying to place it somewhere in the garment where it's not going to show a lot. Again, not here, down on your hips and your knees where nobody's looking really closely. Those are better places for those flaws to land if you can. So plan your cuts around them. Another thing you can do is use fusible interfacing to fuse that area, basically create a patch that will help make sure that that weak point doesn't spread or become a big hole in your garment. Basically a way to use a slightly flawed piece of your fabric safely. There's also fusible web, which lets you fuse any type of fabric to it, but fusible interfacing comes in a ton of different weights. You'll find a rack full of it at your fabric stores. I often get the fairly thin stuff, and I do cut the edges of my little patches with pinking shears so that you don't have a hard, sharp edge show through. When you press that to your fabric, you have just a softer edge that doesn't stand out as much visually. And you iron it on. Fusible interfacing and fusible web are heat reactive glue that is pre-applied to a fabric or sort of created like a fabric textile. So if it's fusible web, you have it between two layers of fabric that you want to fuse together. If it's fusible interfacing, you're putting it usually on the back of the fabric. You put it down, you put a damp cloth over it, you use your hot steam iron for 10 seconds. All these instructions are on fusible interfacing, so you can read them. You don't have to remember what I said too quickly. But that's what you do. You press it down for 10 seconds. The heat and the steam cause the glue to melt up enough and fuse to the fabrics. Useful stuff to know about. I don't tend to use fusible interfacing for garments very much, but I have used it for patches and repairs more often. When you're buying your fabric, you also want to make sure that you have thread to make your garment with. It is a really good idea to get your thread in the right color that works with your fabric, especially if you're going to be doing buttonholes or eyelets that are going to show. But there's other places where the stitching might show, and a really good color match can make a good difference. There are more than one good quality brand out there. I happen to be a big fan of Gutermann. Gutermann is generally regarded as one of the best thread companies. They're available from the big box stores. Some others use Metrocene. I've always liked Gutermann a little better, but your mileage can vary. One cool tip to know about the Gutermann thread, they have this little groove in the bottom, which is a great place to lock your thread into place so you don't have a bunch of loose threads in your thread box or storage that you might have. Not all of us have beautiful racks, walls of racks like my mom did. However, the other cool thing to know is that that actually pulls out of the bottom of the cone and gives you a place where you can store needles. So when you're carrying your thread around in your hand sewing basket, you can have some needles safely stored inside it and have your good quality Gutermann thread handy and not getting into a tangled mess because the thread fit into that little groove. Buy more than you think you're going to need. Buy a bigger spool or a couple of them. Again, especially if you're going to be doing something like buttonholes that use a lot. I'm showing a picture of a cone stand, and thread cones are an option. It is true that serger thread cones are, generally speaking, a lower quality of thread. They're not necessarily going to be a really strong thing to assemble a full garment with. However, they're very inexpensive, and sometimes there is high quality thread on cones, especially if you're getting stuff from professional outlet sources. And a cone stand is a way to get a lot out of that thread using a sewing machine. So one reason why I would use a cone thread would be something I'm whipping up really quickly. It doesn't matter that the thread be really strong, or if it was the right color match for the eyelets. I use so much thread on eyelets and buttonholes. Using the cone thread is fine because the strength isn't really important there. It's important on seams that are going to be bearing weight and pressure. Cone strands come in a couple styles. I do not recommend the light plastic ones. Get a heavy base one. You don't have to mount it to the table. You can just set it up when you need the cone, and that enables the thread to come up over that hook and then be threaded into your sewing machine without creating a tension problem. That's what cone stands are for. Okay, that's thread. Did I skip cutting boards, or is it further down the list?
I was kind of wondering the same thing. Because I remember there being things like measurements in there.
Yeah, I think it's down the list then, so I'm going to keep going because I saw it this morning. We try to keep track of how we organize things. So I talked about ironing boards and irons, and there's the link to the ironing board that I particularly love. There are lots of other good ironing boards in the world. Part of the reason getting a good ironing board matters is getting one that fits your height. I happen to have a very high waist, so my desired height of table is higher than a lot of other people's. It makes a big difference to your back and your comfort and how long you can sew or work on a project, having things at the right height for you. We're going to talk about that more with cutting tables, but it helps a lot with irons. And for some of us, the standard ironing boards really aren't big enough. I definitely see people trying to make do with little apartment ironing boards or little on-the-table ironing boards. If at all possible, get yourself a bigger one. It's really going to make your life easier. The other useful thing to know while we're talking about irons is Iron Off. Iron Off is a product that is made for removing junk from your iron face. This mostly happens if you've accidentally ironed polyester or synthetic fabrics that have melted onto it, or a little bit of that fusible interfacing or fusible web got onto your iron. It happens a lot. It happens to professionals. That's why it's useful to have a tube of iron off in your house. You get your iron hot, you put the iron off on a rag that you don't want to use again, and you use it to wipe and burn that material off your iron. It works really well. It's been around for decades. Highly recommend it. Other notes in the ironing board world are velvet boards and sleeve boards. So velvet boards. I have only in my entire career once had a velvet board around. The costume shop at Northwestern actually did have a velvet board. So I know they exist, but they're rare and most of us don't have them. Why would you want one? So suddenly a bunch of comments are showing up here. A velvet board, the reason that you want a velvet board or something like it, and what I use is usually a terry cloth towel, is because velvet is woven with loops that stick up and then are cut. If you press those with a hot iron, you're flattening those fibers down and crushing your velvet. That's why you don't just take an iron and iron velvet. But sometimes your velvet's been folded for a long time and you really want to steam those creases out. Your best answer is try not to touch the iron to it. Try to only use steam and lift it up. But if you're really trying to get creases out and they're not coming out with just steaming, what I do is I lay the velvet face down on a fluffy terry cloth towel on my ironing board. That way those fibers can stick down into the fibers of the terry cloth instead of getting crushed as hard. And you can lightly iron the back to try to get those creases out of the back of your velvet. There's the pro tip. Velvet boards exist. Most of us don't have them. The other pro tip is sleeve boards. Not a thing you need all the time. But when you are making sleeves, especially tight-fitted sleeves, that's what these little mini ironing boards that look like this are for. They are called sleeve boards, and they are very handy when you need to turn really small things like sleeves. Type of thing you may not have room for in your own home, but probably somebody in your social network has and will lend you. You don't make sleeves every day, so you don't have room to store it. Mine lives in my coat closet because I have a tiny house. Okay. We can move on from irons. Oh, I want to say briefly on the subject of irons and iron quality. I have a Sunbeam iron. I have used Shark irons. My mother had tried in her career a Roweta iron at one point. She found it died just as quickly as the less expensive ones. Mostly having an iron that will get hot enough and that will steam enough are the important things for us, especially for linen. The other really important thing for the life of your iron is to use distilled water in it. If you don't, distilled water is free of the minerals that it distills away. Minerals build up on the inside of your iron. It will stop working. It will be all crusted up, and you will need to get a new iron sooner than you would if you had been using distilled water. Yes, does it feel a little ridiculous to be spending $1 a gallon on water that you iron your clothing with? Sure, but it adds up to the iron lasting longer, and everything works better. So if you have trouble finding distilled water, I understand it can be difficult to find from time to time. Sometimes you will find it in the baby care section or in the healthcare section because it is used in humidifiers and in CPAP machines as well. Other things that need distilled water for the same reason. It's free of inclusions, and so when a machine is heating it all the time, it prevents it from getting a lot of buildup from those inclusions that you get in tap water or well water. Okay, so you've got your fabric, you've pre-washed it, you've ironed it, you've stored it reasonably, and now you're getting ready to put patterns on it. Very, very briefly, I'm going to mention straight grain and bias. I tried to avoid a lot of basic sewing tips in this because that wasn't the focus of this class, and I'm trying to make sure we can keep it under 2 hours. But it's important to remember that fabric has grain and bias is the diagonal of that. So most fabric is woven with fibers going both ways, warp and weft. I'm not even really straight on which one is which. Weavers are just dying that that's not important to me. However, fabric is pretty strong in each direction. On a lot of garments, we can sometimes get away with laying things out in multiple directions. But if you're using a shot silk, a velvet, or another fabric with a nap, sometimes if you lay your fabric out in multiple directions, it looks checky, like they don't match together. So especially if it's any kind of fabric where when you turn it one way, it looks really different, you got to make sure that all your pattern pieces get laid out in the same direction on your fabric so that when they're all sewn together, they all work together and don't contrast. The other important thing to remember is that fabric stretches on the bias. So piece of fabric, it's pretty straight. When I pull it each way, you don't get a lot of distortion. However, when I hold on to the angle and I pull it, you watch the flowers stretch. Fabric stretches on the bias. That's why we make our fitted hose out of bias cut fabric, because it'll stretch and shape around our legs well. Things they did when they weren't using knitted fabrics yet. Knitted fabrics are a pretty modern invention. Knitting sort of in between, but you get my point. Mostly we avoid cutting things on the bias. We want to know that the fabric's going to stretch there and be prepared for it. Exceptions to that are cutting bias strips for bias binding. We'll talk about them later. Okay, on the subject of patterns, I buy cheap brown craft paper or cheap white craft paper from fabric stores and put most of my patterns on those. You can also flatten out brown paper shopping bags and use the back sides of them. Pretty sturdy, lasts pretty well. Another tip that Fiorleaf offered was that if you go to Costco, where they have the pallets of toilet paper and paper towels, there's these big sheets of tag board that come between layers of that, and they just stack them up and recycle them. So if you go to Costco, you can just pick up a stack of them, and they are really useful, especially for a pattern you're going to use for a long time. They're a little heavier weight. It's a great source for inexpensive paper that you can use for your patterns. Okay. The other note I'm going to talk about with your patterns is it's useful to write on them a lot. Probably doesn't show real well this pattern for a hood. You can see I've drawn on the dag shapes of it. Other information that I write on my patterns: how big the seam allowance is or isn't on that pattern. 1/2-inch seam allowance, write it down. No seam allowance, you need to add it. Make sure you write that boldly on your pattern. Other things I write are when I made it and what garment I made from it. So, October 2022, Sphinx blue kirtle is a useful note because that's a different shape than I made the previous kirtle. And I also will note what changes I've made. Added a 1/2-inch at the waist on this one. The size of the gores points actually need to be here. Write it all over your patterns. Pencil's a really good way to do that because it's not going to transfer later if you ironed over it or something like that, where ink might, but a lot of ink absorbs into the paper really well, not going to be a nightmare. Write on your patterns, super useful. Other things that you want to remember to put on your paper patterns are that grain direction that we talked about. Which way does this need to be laid out? I also, when I lay everything out on the table, sometimes for a project, will stop and after I've chalked it all out on the fabric, take photos of it. This turns out to be super useful. I did it the first time because I was really scared to cut the silk for my Burgundian gown. So after I'd laid it all out, I took photos of it. A couple years later, somebody asked me, who was teaching a class on Burgundian gowns, how I'd done the layout, and I had pictures. You'll be really glad you took those pictures later if you try to make the garment again. So keeping a record of how you worked things out in the past helps us out in the future. Another thing that I keep in my pattern folder are cut plans. Not every garment really needs patterns. This is my cut plan. We can see, there we go. For brays. Brays are essentially boxers. They're men's undergarments. Jury is an entirely different class and topic on whether or not women wear them, but because I do play a male persona, I also have made brays for myself. They are 2 rectangles and a square. They have a square gusset between the legs. So I didn't need to make a pattern for them. I just gave myself written instructions of how big I made them, and how far I folded over the waistband, and what size I cut those things. Another set of written instructions I have, this actually came from Mistress Agnes' blog many, many years ago, and it was how she cut out or how she laid out a 14th century coat. I printed it out. I wrote my measurements on there. I keep it in my pattern folder. If I need to cut another coat, this gives me a source to go to. I've since made patterns that actually have a slope at the shoulder to fit my extremely short, slopey, really little shoulders. But this is still a useful record. And it's really useful for how did I lay that out when you're later going, how much fabric do I need to buy to make another one of those garments? And if what you're buying is a different width of fabric, the layout still gives you a good reference to go back to and figure out how you'd lay that out on that new fabric width. Useful thing to keep. Okay, let's move on. I think storage folders. Yeah, there we go. Oh, another great tip on the fabric or on the pattern note is the Elizabethan smock generator. This is a wonderful website. It's been around for a long time. I'm sure they've made improvements and revisions to it. I have not used it again since because I had my measurements put in and it tells you exactly how to lay out, cut, and make an Elizabethan shift or chemise. They say Elizabethan shifts and chemises are basic rectangular construction and go back way further. It looks great with my 14th century clothes. You don't need to just think of it as a late period thing. It's a super useful resource for how to just make a basic against the body layer. You can make them short and make them shirts. You don't have to make them full length and make them chemises. A few tips on that. In the older version, they used to make a sleeve that was very nicely fitted. This is very useful if your chemise sleeve needs to fit inside another tight garment sleeve. However, if, like me, you wear a chemise with a short sleeve kirtle over it and you need to roll those sleeves up to wash dishes or make dinner, on my big work for a living arms, I needed to make my sleeves larger. I had to take my sleeves off my chemise and give myself broader ones. So you may want to adjust that pattern for a sleeve that you can roll up. Other changes you can make, of course, as I said, are making it shorter, and you can cut the neckline all different ways. My strong advice when cutting any chemise out, particularly for the first time, is to cut the neck hole as small as possible initially. And stay stitch. That is machine top stitch inside where you're going to cut that so it doesn't distort. Try it on and very carefully decide how much bigger you want it to be. Neck holes have a way of getting much larger than we expect. Always start with a smaller neck hole than you think you're going to want, and you will save yourself a lot of grief later. Other thing I mentioned here is alterations. My mom wrote an entire book on pattern alteration when I was a small child. We are really hoping to see this book get published again, self-published in the coming year. If pattern alteration was a thing that you wanted to learn a lot about and you were interested in this book, welcome to privately message me or email me, and I'll put you on a wait list if we actually get that book published in the next 6 months. They exist. There are books out there on pattern alteration. My mom's is pretty good. I don't do a lot of paper pattern alteration because most of my garments are closely fitted rather than draped. And but it is useful information to know. And it's certainly, I have the disadvantage to some extent of knowing the information enough that I'm not even clear on how much I've applied it. And I think I do apply it a lot. And so it may be very useful to you. Other things that I keep in my kit as a result are a roll of Scotch tape because cutting and taping paper patterns is part of what you're doing with alterations. That's why tape is there in parentheses. My next note is on how we store our patterns. I keep my patterns in this beautiful accordion file. All my accordion files were originally purchased for other filing projects and later became my pattern boxes. But I have neatly labeled this with all the sort of categories such as Spike Burgundian gown, Spike hoods, male and female, Spike pattern layouts, also tracing paper and some other tools, pressing piece that need to be stored flat live in here as well. I have a separate folder for Enzio. His is bigger because his clothes are bigger, his patterns are bigger. He's a bigger guy. Again, I reused it from another purpose. This was a legal sized folder. It's kind of nice. They're really big. And other things I've included are a couple business cards from places that we ordered accessories for him. It's amazing how quickly we forget. Where did we buy that belt harness? Where did we buy the dagger that went with that? Where did we buy the shoes that went with that? This is a great place to store them. So you can record things either by type of garment or by full outfit. Sometimes I have things organized by the time period and sometimes just by which outfits we've made. I also have a tab in here for heraldry, our heraldry applications and versions of our heraldry. Handy place to keep them because often that's some place you want to trace them from. Other ways that people store their paper patterns. I know that Alexis has a beautiful wall of magazine storage boxes. that have beautiful yellow manila folders, envelopes for each pattern in them. They're labeled, they're sorted. She has shelves and shelves of them. And especially if you have as many as she does, that is a great way to store it. I had less room on my shelves, and those accordion files have served me well and also made it handy to take my patterns with me for pattern swap days. I encourage people to hold these. Bring the garments, bring the patterns, bring blank paper and rulers, and copy each other's patterns. It's a great way to share knowledge and information and get you started towards making a garment you haven't made before. Okay, rulers. We've got lots of pictures of rulers. I think they're next. So, clear grid rulers. There are thin, lightweight clear grid rulers that the Complete Sewing Guide recommended. Back in the 70s, that's what was available. We have come very far in what's available in clear grid rulers today. I took pictures of these ahead of time because boy, is it hard to show you a clear grid ruler on a web camera. The big one here is 24 inches by 6 inches. It's made by Fiskars. It's thick enough that you could use a rotary cutter next to it. I didn't get into rotary cutters because honestly, I don't use them in my SCA cutting. I don't generally recommend them. However, you'll find tools like this with rotary cutters and especially in the quilt notion section of your fabric stores. The higher quality notions are sold at a higher price and they're put on sale at a different time and they're in the quilt notions. But that's where these little yellow grid rulers at the bottom come from. They're OmniGrid brand. I use these a ton in my professional life, but I have found them to be brilliant for small measurements and especially for adding seam allowance and little alterations to patterns. That clear ruler at the bottom there is made by Dritz. It is 6 3/4 inches long. It is exactly a 1/2 inch wide and exactly a 1/4 inch thick. What's brilliant about this is if you are a person who draws your patterns without seam allowance, you can put that little ruler down next to your pattern and trace around the outside of your pattern and that ruler, and you've added your 1/2 inch seam allowance. It is super useful for this purpose. Turn it the other way, use it for a 1/4 inch seam allowance. The only drawback I have found to these tools is that over time, the writing does wear off if you're using them on a day-to-day basis like a professional does. Most of us hand sewing are going to find that tool is going to last just fine. Definitely one I keep in my box as a handy tool. And if you are a person who likes to keep your patterns without the seam allowance, it is brilliant for adding your seam allowances back on again. Okay. The other thing I'll say about rulers is obviously I use yardsticks. I have wooden yardsticks. I have metal yardsticks. The unicorn that I hunt for through my entire life is to find a 36-inch yardstick that is 0 point. 0 point means there is no extended bit at the end. You start your measurement right from the edge of the ruler. I want it to be 0 point on both ends and have inches on both sides of the ruler, and I want it engraved. Why I say that's a unicorn, I own one. I paid $35 for it, used at Hardwick's before they closed their Seattle location. God rest their soul, best tool store we ever had. And it only has the inches on one side. I will pay more money if I ever find one that is engraved metal and has the inches on both sides and is 0 point. Not everybody needs those. That just happens to be my little stump on that subject. However, having a good firm ruler and yardstick that doesn't bend when you're using it, really, really useful, not just for straight lines for rectangular construction, but also you're going to be measuring to make sure that you've got maybe the straight grain or the center front of your garment the same distance from the edge of the fabric while you're laying it out. Hey, we got to cutting table solutions. We've been talking about patterns. What are we going to cut this out on? That link is to the type of cutting table I have. And the reason I bring that one up is that it is really narrow. When it is folded down, it's less than 10 inches wide. We have it stored behind our front door under our coats where they're hanging. I live in a really small house. The basket of things that are leaving the house someday lives on top of it, and the wool blanket that we use in emergencies in sewing or in camping also lives on top of that table. It's multi-purpose, but when I have to cut some fabric, I push the coffee table out of the way and pull that out and unfold it in my living room. It is a really big table, and it is a great height for me. The subject came up because I was talking a lot about having our tables at the right height for us. What height is the right height? Great question. It definitely depends on your body. For me, the height of that cutting table that I use is 35 inches. The height of the ironing table at my favorite height is 36 inches. And I think that's the height I built my table at work, was 36, might even be a little higher. I happen to have a very high waist. My belly button is 41 inches off the floor. I have extra long femurs. I'm not actually that tall. I'm just really set up higher. In contrast, an average dining table height is 31 inches or less. If you're trying to work on your dining table, you're bending over 5 more inches. And yeah, that makes a big difference in how much your back hurts after you do a project. To the same point, if you are crawling on the floor to cut out your fabric, because that's how you have the ability to spread something out, you're going to have a backache and you're not enjoying sewing. Do what you can to try to get access to a better cutting table. Network with your friends, network with the people in your branch. Somebody else has a bigger cutting table. They're going to be happy to have you come and use rather than getting a backache working on your floor. Some other solutions that people I know have used. I know a friend who uses a door on top of her washer and dryer. Washers and dryers are set at a higher height usually than our countertops. I actually use mine as the work height for when I'm casting pewter, so I like that height a lot. It's another solution. Might be another place where you have some flat area that you can use for cutting. When I didn't have the beautiful folding cutting table, which I did get used from another Scadian, what I used was I pulled out my little gate leg dining table that was like 28 inches high and entirely too low for us. And I neatly stacked up 4 Encyclopedia Britannicas on each corner of it. Encyclopedias are useful because they are exactly the same height. And so I could get 4 stacks of exactly the same height. And then I took a 4x8 sheet of plywood that I'd covered in microsuede fabric and put it down on top of there. That was my cutting table. Fairly unwieldy, right height for me, 8 feet wide, worth the trouble to do. Only 6. My husband tells me it was only 6 feet wide. There we are. It was his Warhammer gaming table. There's ways you can use these things for more than one purpose. Obviously, somebody who is a lot shorter doesn't need a high height cutting table. Most of us do. Try to work on a higher height cutting table. It's going to make your life a lot easier. We already talked about clamps and weights because I was looking at a picture of clamps and weights before. Okay. So we've got our fabric on the table. We've got our pattern. What are we going to do now? We're going to pin and we're going to chalk. So pins. I strongly believe that glass head pins are your best value and the best kind of pins to have. Why? They're easy to grab. You can easily hold them in your mouth. You can iron over them and they don't melt. They tend to be more resistant to breakage than the plastic ones, and they tend to be higher quality pins. Yes, you pay a little bit more for them. Yes, that difference is worth the money. They also make silk pins. If you're going to be working with fine silk for lining things, make sure you have sharp pins and that they're lighter weight. You don't necessarily need silk ones, but if you're going to work with silk a lot, it is worth buying silk pins. The other box that I show there in the little picture I'm going to grab, I have one of them here. These are really special glass head pins. They're made by C.S. Osborne. C.S. Osborne is a hand tool manufacturer, and they make a lot of the upholstery tools that I use. I was really excited to discover that they made glass head pins that are a little bit heavier, thicker pin. I use them for pinning upholstery fabrics. I use them for pinning heavier weight fabrics. They're 2 inches long. They are also brilliant as veil pins. They have white and other colors in the box. They are just a much better made pin. If you're looking for a heftier, longer pin that's really going to serve you, they are worth the extra money to get a C.S. Osborne pin. And where you're going to find that are tool stores. Hardwicks does still exist. They're out in Idaho and they exist as a mail order business. That's one place I bet you could get these from. Other source for heavier pins, like if you're pinning coat weight wool or heavy things, is to use T-pins. T-pins are a heavier pin that has a T at the top of them. There's one on the little green pincushion has some T-pins on it. They're useful when you need really heavy duty pins. When you're using really thick pins and you're sewing, it is a good idea to pull them out before the machine goes over them because you're bending the fabric enough that you're not really keeping it flat and level. But straight pins, glass head, definitely worth it. The other reason is compared to those little metal end pins, they're just a lot easier to grab and pull, and you're a lot less likely to lose them in your carpet and in your garments. Pincushions, you can see those two little the classic tomato pincushions were inexpensive ones that have faded very badly in the windows of my workroom. They work fine. I have the little ones with the little Chinese figures around the sides. Those are great. The silk wear out eventually. They're not expensive. I have one great one that I love that has room for my small scissors to sit in the middle of, and that's the one that I keep next to my sewing machine. That's my favorite pincushion. Pincushions sometimes have a little emery strawberry off the side of them. The little strawberry hanging off the side of your thing. What is that for? That is for sharpening pins or removing rust and buildup on them. This is really handy if it's your favorite needle and you really want to keep it. But in general, needles and pins are cheap enough in our modern era that if you do have rust or buildup on them, pretty good idea to simply replace it rather than try to get rid of that rust and keep using it. However, that's what emery strawberries are for, and that's why we have them. Okay, chalking and marking. That second picture there has two little pictures of tailor's chalk. Tailor's chalk you're going to find from fabric stores. The white kind of tailor's chalk I had there is a waxy kind. It's designed to iron off. Designed to, not guaranteed to. Always test on your fabric before you use it, and I'm a little shy of using it for that reason. The blue chalk is more of a hard chalk. These are shaped in a very thin shape, so they give you a thinner edge that you can mark with. Similarly, blue chalk or the dry chalks, I use chalkboard style chalk at work. We sharpen it with our scissors to make it a narrow edge. Those are great if you have an air compressor handy to blow the chalk off, or you're confident that it's not going to stay on, not going to show on the other side of the garment. Colored chalks can sometimes, when the garment is washed or steamed, or even upholstery that gets steam cleaned, bleed through the fabric. So I'm a little leery of colored chalks, but they are useful. I try to mark out at the edges where I'm going to cut that off rather than leaving it on my garment if at all possible. But that other chalk tool shown in that picture is one of my favorite things ever. I'm very excited to find. It is still available from Wawak. I was not aware of Wawak. They are an online company that is an excellent sewing tool and notion catalog company. A lot of other people have used them very successfully. And as we have lost many of the businesses we used to have that we used to order from, I used to order supplies from Clotilda in the past. They're not around anymore. Wawak still is. They're really great, really highly recommended. And they still have this chalk pencil. I'm going to grab it so that I can wave it at you while I talk about its extraordinary features. It holds different colors of chalk. That's what the little box is. I have blues and reds and yellows, but mostly I use white. You push the yellow button at the end and it opens up the little clutch that is holding the stick. So the whole stick of chalk fits in there, but you only need to have a little bit sticking out at the end. Very much like a mechanical pencil, even simpler, no springs involved. But that way you have a little tiny chalk edge for chalking around your patterns. Really, really useful. One of my favorite tools I ever bought. Bought it years ago at Hancock Fabrics. Very excited that they're still available. If you don't have one, yeah, you do want one. Makes a great gift for the sewers in your life. Okay. Those are the primary marking tools I use. The other marking tools that I have down there are at the bottom. Marking wheels are useful if you are transferring marks, particularly into the center of a garment. The places I have used the most often are marking out dags. We don't do a lot of darts because darts aren't period, but frequently that's what marking tools would be used for. I forgot to list, but this is what transfer paper looks like. You get the transfer paper, pull out a sheet of it in a color that contrasts with your fabric, but you'll be able to see. You lay that transfer paper colored side down on your fabric. If you can, mark on the back of your fabric. You're going to be happier because then if you messed it up, it doesn't show on the front of your fabric. Lay this color side where you want to mark, put the pattern on top, and then you use those tracing wheels. There are smooth or perforated, pointed tracing wheels. The perforated ones will give you little dots. They sort of perforate your pattern. Smooth one will give you a straight line. Both work, depending on the fabric, equally well. That way you're able to trace out a pattern onto your fabric. That's basically it's tracing paper for fabric. And that's what the wheels are for. I have one that's really, really sharp, like needle sharp, that I'm not even in that box because it hurts you if you run into it in the wrong time. It's useful really for pouncing patterns, which is something they did in period. That's how they transferred cartoons onto paintings in period, where they had little holes in the paper pattern and they used a little bag of colored chalk and pounced through those little holes to mark out the pattern. Now they make modern tracing paper. We don't have to do it the hard way. Layout single layer. Just going to take a minute to talk about the fact that modern patterns and modern sewing techniques are very much of the opinion that how you laid out a lot of patterns was to have the fabric folded in half and to lay everything out and cut it so that you created the two equal sides of things. In general, this is less efficient than the way medieval people laid out their fabrics. A lot of the way our garments are cut and designed was based on how could they use the maximum amount of the fabric with the minimum amount of waste. So when you're figuring out how to cut period patterns, figuring out how to get them fit right next to each other so that there's almost no layout waste is pretty important. We have a few extant 16th century tailors' books that are reproduced that show how they laid out patterns on things. That's literally what is in those books. And they were really efficient about it. They weren't laying them out on the fold. I don't think that laying things out on the fold is an efficient way to do things. You're going to waste a lot more fabric. It's harder to mark, doubles. It's a better idea to chalk it out, turn it over, chalk it out. As you're working mark, you've cut the left front, you've cut the left back. Mark those on the back of your fabric to keep track of what you're cutting. It's really useful, particularly to mark what is the center front, because sometimes that neck hole and the armhole look really similar. Marking as you go is really going to make you happier as you're laying it out and cutting it. Okay, I think we can move on because now we're on cutting tools, right? Haha, we are. Scissors! So that top picture, the really big scissors shown there are my upholstery scissors. Those are a heavy pair of whisk shears. They are brilliant. If you're going to cut a whole bunch of wool or canvas, that weight of scissors are just great, and I love them. For all the garments I've cut at home, I haven't needed them. So not a thing you need in your household. Next to them are a pair of Ginger dress shears. These are the standard dress shears. I recommend everybody get these. If you don't have a good sharp pair, either get the ones you have sharpened or wait till they go on sale and get them half off at Joann's. If they come with the sheath, it's really useful to keep the sheath around because someday you're going to want to take these scissors to a sewing project day. And this is going to protect both your scissors and everything else in your basket and box. Keep the sheath. It's going to serve you in the future. Another thing, this is a tip for gift giving in the future. My mother, because she was a seamstress and because I'm a beautiful tool-loving daughter, gave me all three of my Ginger shears, my full-size ones, my 6-inch ones, and my little embroidery-size ones, for subsequent birthdays and holidays when I was in college, and she had them all engraved with this little dragon's eye symbol that I used as my personal symbol. So all of my scissors are engraved. And so if I go to a project day and at risk losing my scissors, I know which ones are mine because they have an engraving on them. Totally great gift idea for large people in your life, especially if you're trying to encourage a young sewer. Give them the really good scissors labeled as theirs. A small note on the whole, don't cut anything but fabric with your fabric scissors. This is generally true and generally wise, but the fact is actually paper does not dull scissors all that much. If you had to cut your paper pattern with your scissors, it's not the end of the world. What does mess up your scissors real well are staples and anything else that you might run into that you're not supposed to. And that's why you shouldn't do anything but fabric with your fabric scissors. Also, tape junks up your shears, makes you think they're dull. Sometimes when my work scissors seem really dull and I've had to cut open packages with them, I take out some lighter fluid and clean off the scissors blades and they're a lot sharper again. It is a good idea to have your scissors professionally sharpened. I am not a person who's confident or willing to let just anybody sharpen my scissors. On Bainbridge Island, there's Island Edge. He's really great, and I take all my scissors to him. If you don't know your local sharpening shop, your local fabric store, sewing machine shop, or kitchen shop may have a connection to a local sharpener. Also, your local garden center. The guy who does my scissor sharpening also sharpens garden pruners and does one day a week at Bay Hay and Feed on Bainbridge Island, or one day a month, where he does sharpening there. So have good scissors, get them sharpened. They do go on sale. That's a good way to buy these at a half price. Okay. And we talked briefly about the fact that I don't think rotary cutters are very useful for most of what we do. If you use a rotary cutter, it's a good idea to have a rotary cutting mat. They do make a set of rotary cutting mats that will lock together, so you can get like the 8-inch long or 8-foot long rotary cutting if you want. The only time that I would think that was really useful is if I had to cut a ton of bias strips to bind the edges of a whole garment. In upholstery, we cut bias all the time because welt, the piping on the edges of everything, is cut on the bias. I still cut most of it with shears because rotary cutters don't work that well on upholstery fabric. If you have a rotary cutter, having your blade sharp, they do make sharpeners, or just replace the blade makes a huge difference, because if you've got a little ding that you run into the little edge of your ruler or something with that rotary cutter, every few inches, it doesn't cut through the threads. Just a big frustration. Also really easy to hurt yourself with. So caution with the rotary cutters. You're better off with a good sharp pair of shears. That's my opinion. Okay. Moving on.
I was going to bring.
O'clock.
It's 11 o'clock. Did you want to take a break?
I think this might be a great time for us to take a break, because we're sort of at the end of the cutting topic and we're going to move on to sewing next. Yes. So we're going to take a 5-minute break. I'm going to drink some water, and anybody who wants to can get up and move around. I've been talking at you for almost an hour, and it's a good time for us to take a look and see if there was any questions that I should grab while we're on break.
All right. Well, we'll go ahead then, and we'll see everybody in about 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yep, thank you. that worked out well. His Excellency made me chicken noodle soup for breakfast, so.
Yay! That is very good. Okay.
It is. Did you have a chance to look through the comments, or?
No, I can't see them.
Oh.
So I've got.
Okay, it looks like His Excellency has thrown one up there.
Okay.
About pinking shears.
Pinking
What
shears.
types do
Do I have a type I recommend? I was fortunate to just receive a Ginger pair. You can have them sharpened, but I don't think I have a strong recommendation. Ginger and Wiss are the two best brands I know. There are a lot of other good brands out there, but those two are solid, reliable, professional grade.
Excellent. Okay.
It's being recorded, and it will be posted in the future, and our outline with the links will be posted with that. Yes.
Our totally professional looking outline.
Come on, a Word document's still professional.
That's right.
Thanks, Kyrie.
Okay. All right. So we are at 11:06. Are you ready?
I'm ready. Let's move on to our next slide. Thank you for understanding my and the next slide, please, hand gesture. I appreciate it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It was very clear. Oh, wait. Clovis has another one. Okay. It says the needle spike wheels are good for copying the seams of existing garments onto paper since they can pierce through several layers of fabric. Yep. I was going to add on the topic of cutting tables and sewing tables. If you have a large space and you are also near your state surplus property depot, I have a giant conference table that is my cutting table and my blocking for knitting because His Excellency wanted a conference table.
It's no, they're super useful. Another tip was Elizabeth Mead and her partner Eleanor are, as you know, very, very, very different in height. And Elizabeth was able to use a dining table height because she's a very petite woman, and that is a good height for her. And they put it up on risers for Eleanor to use it as a cutting table. So you can buy those risers, dorm bed risers, put them under the forelegs of your dining table, get it up to a better cutting table height as well.
I'll have to do that for Clovis because I am much shorter.
Yeah.
All right, let me go ahead and advance your slide here.
Okay. Here is my beloved Bernina 830. I'm going to take a minute to explain and apologize. This is one of the best machines ever made, and I feel very strongly about its features. Many people who have a sewing machine will have one they will tell you is the best one, and they're all right, but I'll tell you what's great about the Bernina 830. After I learned to sew initially on a Singer Featherweight, Singer Featherweights are wonderful. They're still really highly valued by quilters. They only go straight. They don't zigzag, but you can hook them up to a treadle machine, AC or DC power, and they fold into a little tiny box and are very portable. However, once you graduate to wanting a machine that can zigzag or do other things, in my opinion, your best dollars ever spent will be on a Bernina 830. My mother actually bought this new when I was a very small child, and she was a very poor divorcee, and she kept a roof over our head and fed her family for over 40 years with it. She actually, this is actually hers I took a picture of, wore the paint off on the front. She was using it so much professionally. It is all metal. It is made in Switzerland. It has no electronic boards to go wrong. It's all real gears in there. These machines still sell used for around $700, which is what I paid for one in the mid-90s. They are really worth the money. I went off to college. Northwestern University had an amazing costume shop full of Bernina 830s. I use a professional machine at work. The machine I use to put invisible zippers on pillowcases is a Bernina 830. So I don't have experience with other machines because I found the best one at a young age, and that's what I kept using. So whatever machine you have, read the manual. Don't have the manual? Good news, the internet does. Every machine manual you could possibly want is on the internet. Go find it and sit down and read it. Why, do you ask? Well, sometimes you'll find that maybe, like my mother, you're a professional who's been using this awesome machine for over 30 years, and your snarky adult daughter actually sat down and read the manual and discovered that this little tool came in your toolbox. You've never used it. It's a little flathead screwdriver that has this little pin sticking out from the end. That is designed to fit into the screw that holds the needle in place, so you can, doesn't slide out because it's got a pin in the middle, and undo and change your needle really easily. 30 years, she didn't know that's what this tool did. Super useful. Read your manual, you'll find things like that. Also, how to thread your machine correctly, how to check the tension on it, how to thread your bobbin correctly, how to adjust the tension on your bobbin. A lot of us know about where the thread is going through in front of our machines. We're sometimes scared to look at the bobbin casing, but there's a little screw on the side of your bobbin casing, and ideally a little screwdriver that came in your toolbox with your machine. You might need to tighten or loosen that little screw to have the right amount of thread tension on your bobbin, and yeah, it makes a big difference. Before you start sewing your garment together, take some of those scraps from cutting it out and practice. Sew on your machine, see how the tension's working, see how the thread color works. Adjust the tension, make sure you have the needle in correctly. Needles are flat on one side, that needs to be in a particular direction on your machine, find out what it is. I had to work really hard to memorize the bobbin placement because my professional machine in the Baronesa 830, the bobbin goes a different direction, and it's like the thread has to go to the left and one goes on from the front and one goes on from the back, and that's the only thing I could do to memorize them. Don't be ashamed to have to look back at your manual every time you use your machine. This isn't something everybody's brain stores, even if they do it all the time, but it is where we run into frustration with a sewing machine. So take the time to get it in correctly, get the right needle, get the right threading, get the right tension. On the subject of needles, dull needles can often be the source of the problem. So don't be afraid to just replace your sewing machine needle with a new one. They aren't that expensive. It is really money well spent. Similarly, as we talked about with pins, they make finer ones for silk. This is a good idea. It puts a smaller hole in them. They make heavier ones for denim or leather. If you're sewing heavy canvas, those are a better idea. I definitely don't recommend the diamond or needle shaped ones, even in upholstery leather. I have never needed anything that wasn't a round tip. They cause too big of a hole, and I think they're for saddle making. So round point is usually what you need in needles. Universal Schmetz, the brand that's everywhere, is worth getting. Buy an extra set of them, keep them around. And when, gosh, it's just not working and it's snagging and it's not meeting, try replacing your needle. It's frequently the right solution. Other thing I'm going to mention is table and knee lift. Baronesa 830 and many other sewing machines come with an accessory table that you can slide over the arm that creates a larger surface area. Really nice when you're sewing large flat seams or anything that's going to have a tendency to want to pull away from the machine to have a bigger surface area up there. It latches on, it latches off, it lives in the storage box the rest of the time. Knee lift is what fits into that little black hole at the bottom of that machine in front of us. And it, like it implies, allows you to turn your knee to the side to lift the presser foot up. Because professional sewing machines use a knee lift as the only way to lift them for the most part, I use a knee lift constantly, and therefore I'm utterly incapable of sewing without it and get really cranky if I don't have a knee lift on my sewing machine. Most people don't have that particular addiction. However, if you're doing something where you're going to be stopping and starting really often, or something where you want both hands on the fabric while you're lowering it down, the knee lift is really handy. So it's a tool in the box you might want to learn how to use. That's what it's for. I think we've covered everything on this machine that's really relevant. With your sewing machine, it's also a really, really good idea to clean it and to oil it. Little sewing machine cleaning brushes like that one are very inexpensive. If you don't have one, pick one up. It's for brushing all the lint out of your sewing machine. That link there is a blog entry that my mother actually wrote on how to oil her Baronesa 830. Good news, the internet is full of this. So if you have a different model, YouTube and other blogs are very likely actually going to show some well-meaning, knowledgeable person showing you how to oil or maintain your machine. When my Baronesa got stuck in a stitch that I didn't want it stuck in, my mom found a video on YouTube where the guy showing how the gears get jammed in the top and what you can do to unjam them. I didn't have to take it to a professional. Absolutely look to YouTube. A lot of the solutions are out there. If you're a person who knows all this, thank you for sharing your stuff on YouTube. It was really helpful. But on the subject of machine oil, You might think, oh, I don't use the machine very often. I don't need to oil it. And reportedly, less frequently used machines need oiling more than regularly used machines. So still a good idea to maintain and oil your machine. It's going to help it have a longer run and just run smoother. And that makes everything go better. Sergers, overcast foot, pre-finishing. Okay, the overcast foot we talked about in pre-finishing. That's all that note means there. This is a serger. This is a serger I use at work. It's a Juki 3-thread. I also have a Singer 4-thread that I use at home. Sergers are a little bit intimidating because in addition to the fact that they have multiple threads, they sew over the edge of the thing, they also have a knife that cuts off the excess threads. And you're right, that knife is scary. Anything that can cut your fabric or you while you're sewing sounds scary, right? They do put a guard in front of it. I've never heard of anybody actually cutting themselves on a serger knife. I have, in fact, worn out a serger knife and had to replace it because I use this professionally. I don't cut fabric with the serger. That's just from more than 10 years of cutting the loose threads off of hard fabrics. I had to replace the knives on my serger. So that's a thing to know. You can replace them. You can also turn them up out of the way and have it not cutting. So if you're really afraid of cutting your thing, you can take the knife function off. Other things to know about sergers, you may not have one. There's a good chance you know somebody who does. If you need to pre-finish a lot of things put together, ask around. Somebody will let you probably use their serger. I choose, rather than to use the serger to finish seams, to finish the edges of every piece before I assemble it. This is really handy if you're going to make any alterations to it later, because taking out serging is a lot harder than taking out straight stitches because there's a lot more thread there. And it just makes it easier for everything to fold open and lay flat as well. What I don't recommend serging the edge of is an edge that you're going to use on the rolled hemmer. It adds too much thickness, so I wouldn't serge those edges. This is a photograph of the inside of the serger. I even left it authentically dirty. All the dust that was in there is still there. And that's where people get pretty intimidated by sergers. They look pretty scary to thread. So here's my useful tip on dealing with a serger. Ideally, you get a serger that's already threaded. You want to change colors on it. Sure, you've got your cone set up. Cut off the thread up by the cone. Tie your new color to the previous thread quite securely. Make sure it's secure. Do that on each of them. Take your scrap of fabric and sew it on through, and the thread pulls right through correctly, all the existing threading right on out. Doesn't always go through the needle, although sometimes it does. Bless them. And sometimes you have to rethread the needles, but it'll usually save you a lot of the threading steps. The other thing to know, that picture next to it is the threading guide that is usually, almost always, on the front panel of your serger. You don't have to go get your manual. You do have to take a look at this and make your eye line up with which loop is which, but they do color code them on sewing machines usually. And sergers almost always come with a pair of tweezers that have a bent end on them. This is very, very useful for threading your serger because there's places where you have to get the thread through a little hole, and they are complicated. Have patience, follow the chart, use the tweezers if you have to, refer to the manual and adjust the tension so that it's working correctly. And a serger will be an amazing way to finish the edges of your garment so that it does not fray when you machine wash it later. All these things are modern things we do. They do not show on the outside of our garments. They just make it easier for us to use and wear them. Okay, so that's good on sergers. Dags! Dags. And the truth is, of course, dags do come up in modern sewing. If you're making like a bird costume and it has feathery ends on it. Here's the sleeve. I have that garment there. But there's me with Maddalena and Marcella in their beautiful Italian, and I'm showing off my 14th century Italian. So, a couple tips on successfully doing dags. Number one, draw the dags out before you cut them out and stitch them before you cut them out. I am talking here about lined dags. Obviously, if you have dags that are just cut in wool, fairly resistant to fraying, none of this is relevant. This is if you're going to line them. So step number one, and I don't have a drawing for this, is when you're sewing, when you are stitching in the valley, that is this point up at the top, you do not stitch straight here. Stitch 1 or 2 stitches straight across in the valley. Then go on around your next shape. Up in the valley, 1 or 2 stitches straight across. This is really important. Thank you, Truly Carmichael, for teaching me this. The next thing you're going to do is after you've sewn around them all, is you're going to cut them out. And when you cut curved shapes, you need to clip or wedge. That's what this is an illustration of, clipping and wedging, so that that excess bulk in the seam allowance has somewhere to go and can lay flat when it's turned correctly. As you might imagine, cutting little tiny wedges out of many, many dags sounds like a terrible nightmare. That's why I was really, really pleased that my brilliant mother taught me this, because she makes doll clothes. Use pinking shears to cut them out. Pinking shears cut all your little wedges for you. So cut out your edges now that you've sewn them. You're following along, you're cutting all your little wedges. Then when you turn it, it's really fast, turns and lays flat. What could have been more like a 14-hour project was around a 2-hour project to do the dags on those 2 sleeves. Another tool that's coming down the line in the pictures, but I'm going to grab it. I have this little bentwood box that I keep all my basic sewing tools in. The bamboo corner turner is also really useful when you're turning all these delicate little dags. It is made of bamboo. It's thinner than wood. It has a very slightly rounded, very sharp little point and a rounded end at the other end. They still sell them in fabric stores. They are entirely worth your money for turning and pushing that out so you get the really perfectly flat little corner on your dags when you sew them. Those are my useful dag tips. Understitching. I was really grateful that they had really good illustrations of this. This is a thing I have generally failed to do on my garments, but is super useful. You've assembled your garment with a lining. You've sewn the lining and the face together. If you then simply decide to wear it, often that lining wants to roll out and show a little bit. What you can do to prevent this, and this is easiest done before you've finished the rest of the garment. That's why I'm telling you this now, like on my kirtles before I do the armholes, when I should have done this. Understitching is sewing the seam allowance to the lining, and this creates pressure that helps keep all that lining going in and helps the face keep out without the lining rolling out. These illustrations were from the Complete Sewing Handbook. They're very useful. Definitely go back and reference them if you need to. It's a useful thing to remember to do that I tend to forget. It's another place where machine sewing can make your life a lot easier. And I love how it was a keyhole neckline, just like we do on a lot of garments. So look, the 70s, they look just like the 14th century or 10th century or whatever. Okay, so that's understitching. Pressing, bias binding, facing, and lining. Okay, so when you're sewing, it's a good idea to have your iron and ironing board out as well, and to press open the seams as you're working. It's going to help everything lay flat. It's going to allow places where you have seams to lay over each other. Expect to need to press things while you're working on them. Bias binding, another way to finish the raw edges of your garment inside it so that it does not fray when you launder it is to use a bias binding. Where did I put it? Here it is. So you cut a thin strip of lightweight fabric. In this case, I used a thin silk. And you machine sew it to the seam allowance. Then you fold it over and press it and machine sew it down. That way you've encased your seam allowance in this thin layer of fabric. Why are you doing this on the bias? Number one, because it will fold over that edge smoothly. It will travel around curves very smoothly. Number two, fabric does not fray on the bias. So you actually do have a raw edge of it next to that last top stitching line, but it won't fray there because you cut it on the bias, because the fibers are going at angles instead of straight. So it's also called a Hong Kong finish. You can definitely look for instructions on doing a Hong Kong finish, and they will show you how to do that. But in this case, it was a way to have a sturdy finish on the armhole of a coat without adding a lot of extra bulk. I have also done that as a solution on the neckline of garments where I've machine sewn it on and then hand stitched it down again where it could show, but the first layer was done by machine, and that makes it go a lot faster. The other thing I'm going to talk about is facings. This is my yellow gown, and linings. So there's a couple things about this. One thing I want to talk about is that you don't have to line the entire garment. Sometimes, like me, you have less lining fabric left than it would take to line the whole garment, but also it adds a bunch of bulk and excess and weight and expense. So on this garment, this is a gown, it has tippet sleeves. My lining in the back only goes to below my hips. That way, where the lining ends doesn't show because it's in the fullness of the skirt. It ends below my butt, essentially, and I just have it with a rolled hem there. The front panels of this gown, on the other hand, are lined all the way to the bottom. That's because this gown can fold open in the front, and that way the lining shows, and that way it looks like I have a fully lined garment. Nobody knows that there's no lining in the sides and back of my garment, because it just doesn't show. The kirtle and my body hide that. The other thing we did with this garment is that in addition to the lining, we did a facing around the neck hole. These are other pieces of the wool. They are sewn in the same seam with the lining and then hand stitched down over the lining, to the lining basically, rather than all the way through. This guaranteed that instead of the lining having the potential to roll out and show a little bit of yellow, whatever showed around my neckline was going to be green, no matter what I did with that garment. This is a useful trick. You can go back to the cards. It's my outline. It's nice of her to go back to the cards. Okay. Pressing, bias, binding. Buttons! Okay, so also on that gown, another amazing, brilliant solution that my mom had. This, the wool on this was fairly stiff, and when I tried to make cloth buttons from it, I had a really hard time getting buttons that I liked the shape or feel of. They wouldn't really form balls. It was not a loose, flexible wool. It was a really stiff wool. So I made my buttons with the button machine at work. These are covered metal buttons. You can go to a fabric store like Pacific Fabrics where they will make buttons for you. You can go to a upholstery shop where they make buttons for you. You can write to me because I have a button machine and we'll make buttons for you. But upholstery buttons are metal shells on a metal back. If I laundered them, they would rust. I wouldn't want that, would I? So what we did was rather than sew them on, we did eyelets, and the shank of the button goes through the eyelet and is held by a cotter pin. We added to the list a link to cotter pins because people are like, where did you find the cotter pins? And I had to admit that I actually found them in my mom's antique button box attached to other buttons and took them all off of other buttons. You can find cotter pins at better hardware stores, probably Tacoma Screw or a place like that would have them. But it turns out that people who do military recreation very similarly use this technique to hold their buttons on. Was not uncommon in the 18th and 19th century for buttons to be held on with a cotter pin or something like that at the back. Totally useful way to have buttons on your garment that you can remove before laundering. Protects your garment and your buttons from the laundering. Because the buttons rub on everything else in the launder. It's another reason to take them off. Another note on bobbins is, on buttons, is to sew them with heavy thread. That would be carpet thread or upholstery thread when you're buying it at the fabric store. If, again, you can find your friendly neighborhood upholstery shop, they exist in most towns. I grant it, we're kind of rare, we're sort of a weird breed, but we're around almost everywhere. Many shops use disposable bobbins, like this little cardboard one here. I have a few that I scored from the last job I worked at another shop 19 years ago that I keep around because it's a way to have heavyweight thread for sewing on buttons in a small portable form that is easy to carry in your kit with you. That's why heavy bobbins are useful to know about. Find an upholsterer who uses disposable bobbins, buy some from them. It might be something you can find at a sewing machine shop as well, because often those shops cater to both professional and home sewers. Those are my big points on buttons. So now we're going to talk about buttonholes and eyelet makers. This is another thing that I strongly believe you can do with a machine. I completely believe that hand sewing eyelets will look better and potentially last well. However, I have gotten many, many years of service out of my machine eyelets, and here's how I make them. I use the buttonholer, which is made by the Grice Company. They make a bunch of different versions of this. I don't even know if they're still being made today. Mostly we find them used. I had one of these. My mom had one. I'd used hers for years. I liked it a lot. I had one that didn't have the eyelet cartridge in it. I really wanted the eyelet cartridge. And I went to a local sewing machine store and I asked them, and they're like, oh, we don't sell that. But they had a used one because they take them in when they take in trade-in machines. That tends to be how the sewing machine shops get these. And they sold it to me for $10, and it had the eyelet cartridge in it. So it was totally worth buying. And then I got rid of the other one that didn't have the eyelet cartridge. Other people have very successfully found these on Etsy and eBay. So they do exist out there. Now, the box that I have actually had a thing on the back that had like 10 different models that work for different machines. But the most common machine type works with a short shank. I have mine already attached to the short shank, which is like a foot attachment that doesn't have a foot on it. It just goes straight down and has a screw. A lot of machines come with these. You can attach the plastic invisible zipper foots that you buy at fabric stores to them as well. That's often what you might have used it for with modern sewing. There are different models of these. They will probably still work for your machine, but you're going to have to make sure that they're able to connect to your machine successfully. One of the other things I had to do with my Bernina, the little lever that holds the feet on, which is one of the brilliant things about the Bernina, is that you can just hook the foot on and off. You don't have to use a screwdriver every time you change the feet. So if you change the feet a lot, it's really useful. However, on my original machine, the lever stuck straight out the back and it ran into this tool. And it turned out they make a different one. And I was able to get a lever that goes off to the right. And that's the one I use now, so it doesn't run into this machine and I can do machine eyelets. So yeah, was it worth altering my machine to make this work? Heck yeah, 100%. Worth the money. Okay, I'm going to try the other camera and we're going to see if I can show you how to put this on the machine and use it. Let's see. While I'm still showing you this, I'm going to show you how it works as far as I can, in that on the underside, it has a plate that you lift up, and you've got a cartridge inside there, or you don't have one in there yet. When you take the cartridge out, you will see there's a little gear head at one end. This plate slides around. It slides back to fit in the box that it's stored in. So you may have to move that plate around to see that gear head and get it into position. You select your cartridge, and I select the eyelet cartridge because it's my favorite, but they make other buttonholes. And you fit it in, and it's a little tricky to make sure that it gets right in. And sometimes you turn this little knob, which basically turns the gear so that it'll fit into the teeth of your cartridge. Make sure your cartridge is all the way laid in flat. The door will latch back on, and you're good to go. The other thing on this machine is a width adjustment on the side. Mine always slides to widest. It always does the same width no matter where I put it. It's an imperfect, very inexpensive machine. Some machines you do set your zigzag stitch width, and that'll make a difference. On my machine, it doesn't, because this moves everything. Your needle just goes up and down. This does the rest of the work. What this knob on the top does is it moves the position through the around that little cartridge, so you can get yourself to the same starting point every time. It also has a throat plate. Sorry, it's so backwards. With a little mark on it, so you are lining up exactly where you want your buttonhole to be. And by knowing where your starting point is, you're going to make sure that you're starting the buttonhole or eyelet at the same distance from the edge on the garment, so they all line up nicely down the edge of the garment. Okay, shall we try the other machine? We're gonna go to camera 2. What I have tried to do is make it so that it's not talking to me, but
Is it loaded up?
The microphone will work on it. So we're going to see how that goes.
Okay. Have you got it loaded onto StreamYard?
Yeah. Let me see if I
Okay. And now it's time for our song and dance number. La 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 la. Sewing things, totally not killing time. No.
Technology is terrible. Okay. We were in StreamYards, and of course we had to
Yes. What was that?
We were in StreamYards, but you know, the phone had to do its thing.
It kicked itself out. Ah, see. The things we're learning. I would do more song and dance, but I'm kind of tired, and heaven only knows what could happen. Nothing good. Nothing good is the answer.
Okay. All right.
Just gonna,
Can you hear me?
okay. I can hear you. I can't see.
I'm seeing a picture of it looking at the sewing machine.
Clovis, do you see?
I don't.
Oh, I
Okay,
have to.
cool.
No, I have to hit enter. There we go. It was my test screen. No. Okay.
Oh wait, I do.
Oh, there we go. He'll get you loaded here. I was going to comment the buttonhole thing. I'm having flashbacks to my mom's Kenmore box that had the little template thingy in there. It looks like magic. I'm really not sure how it works, but she always got it to work.
Okay. I'm going to mute this laptop so we don't have two.
Okay.
Okay.
I got it.
Oh, Clovis has got it.
Oh, laptop.
Oh. If we can.
There we go.
Let me zoom in. Doesn't. Can we make it zoom in?
Hold on, 1 second.
1 second.
No.
We're playing. Oop. Clovis is our man behind the curtain here. Oh, there we go.
Okay. How are we doing? We are not focused on the right part here. I had made this zoom in before. Why isn't it letting me?
It is entirely because you have an audience. I know this from personal experience.
There. Is that zooming in for you?
No.
No.
Clovis, is it possible to make it zoom in on our end?
It is blown up.
Okay, Clovis says it is blown up.
Well,
I don't.
okay. We'll work from this distance, and I hope it will be visible to people. So, and let's mute one of these so I'm not hearing an echo. The correct way to do this would be to mount the short shank onto my machine like I would a presser foot, and then attach this machine to it. I, however, am extremely lazy and avoid doing that. So what I do is I turn off the feed dog on my sewing machine. This machine allows you to turn the feed dog off. The feed dog is the part that moves things forward underneath the presser foot. I'm able to turn it off so it's not active because, again, this machine moves the fabric around for you. You don't want that active. If you don't have that function on your sewing machine, the buttonhole machine handily comes with, making a mess, a plate, a metal plate that you would screw down to your machine, lined up with the hole there, and that would make sure that your feed dog wasn't interrupting with the movement of this. It also gives you a little more pressure between the garment. This is really useful for thin things because I am usually putting eyelets into at least 4 layers of linen. I do not need that extra pressure, and I do not use this plate. But you might need to. Okay. The important thing in putting this on is that this little toothed part has to go over the needle screw on the machine. This part here has to fit into the socket because it's the short shank foot base. So I get it into position. I get my thing ready to go over the needle hole. And then I actually push up. And that gives me a little bit of room to get it underneath. Super elegant, as you can see. There we are. We're latched on with that little right hand angle on that latcher. Okay. I check that we're in position. I've got my scrap fabric that we're doing an eyelet onto. And I usually go around this 3 times. I recommend that you turn this microphone off while I do this because I think it's going to be really loud.
I don't know that we can turn off your microphones.
Okay, can I mute?
Oh, we can turn off her microphone.
Oh, wait, Clovis says we
can't
can.
Okay.
turn off her speakers on her.
Oh, okay, yeah, go ahead and kill her mic.
Here.
Okay, she's got it.
She's got it muted on her end.
Okay. Spike, it sounds like you are still muted on your end there.
Yes.
Oh, and there you are.
Muted
Excellent.
them both. So I'm going back to this camera. We can probably leave the sewing machine camera for the moment. I hope that some of that showed, but that is basically how easy it is. I go around it 3 times. I do not use a hole punch. I take a big heavy awl and punch through. This is actually really important because a hole punch actually cuts the fibers and an awl is actually going to push them aside. That's part of this being a strong eyelet for a long time, is that you're not cutting before you do it. You can, of course, do machine eyelets and hand stitch over them later. This is a great way to get the garment done and able to be worn before the event and not break your hands sewing 50 eyelets on your garment. Again, if you're in the area, you can make an appointment and hook you up if you don't have all this on your own machine. I think we have another slide for buttonholes.
Okay, Clovis, can you put us back to the slides? Yep.
We can lose the sewing machines.
Yeah. But it's so pretty.
So pretty. Okay. So we this machine. These are some of the pictures of the machine. My mom's model was the now for machines that have zigzag. Still works just fine because her machine zigzags. So as I said, there's multiple models out there, and I cannot 100% guarantee that everyone will work for your machine, but so far everyone I've encountered has. Okay. When you are going to cut your buttonholes, the tool that I usually use to cut the buttonholes is an X-Acto knife. My mom bought thousands of the spade point blades, and so has a lot left, even though she's retired now. They're extremely sharp. They're extremely effective. The pro tip, and this is again from the Complete Sewing Guide, is to put a pin on either end so that when you cut, you do not risk cutting through the end of your buttonhole. This is useful, although I'll be honest, if I've ever accidentally cut through it, I've just thrown it back on the machine and zigzagged really hard. So, you know, it's not like it's not savable. They also tell us about the same buttonhole machine. What are these other tools, you ask? So that accordion-looking tool is a buttonhole marking tool that enables you to mark your buttonholes evenly over, like, there's 8 or 10 on there. I don't personally use this. I tend to use a little tiny ruler and chalk and mark them myself because sometimes you have to zhuzh a little bit for where things land at the waist or things like that. However, my mom did all the buttonholes on that green gown and the purple sleeves that go with it. Those were a lot of buttonholes. She used that tool. She was really glad she had it. The other tool there, and this is just in the, if you find an antique one of these, what they're useful for, they're brilliant. My mom's came from my great-grandfather, my great-step-grandfather, who was a tailor. My great-grandmother was a seamstress. My mom then found me an identical one at an estate sale, so I have one as well as the one that she had. Both of ours, the spring came broken on them. They're very heavy. They're cast metal. It's a little hard to see, but what this has is a blade and a hole punch and a marked wheel that you loosen the end of and move into position. You select it for the length of the buttonhole you want, you put your garment in there, you squeeze tightly, and it chops through just that amount of buttonhole because the anvil side is just the length you want. The hole punch side works with the parts on that wheel for the keyhole shaped button, the heavier coat buttons that have that sort of eyelet, and then the straight buttonhole. So buttonhole cutters exist. I've also seen sort of straight chisels be used. Most of us are going to use an X-Acto knife. Put pins on the end, don't have regrets later. And I didn't take a picture of the awl, but I hope we know what owls look like. Corner turner, we've already talked about that when we talked about dags. The other tool in this picture is the Clover Easy Hold seam ripper. Okay, everybody needs seam rippers. There's nobody who is such a good stitcher that they've never used a seam ripper. That's BS. We all have to use them a lot. It's part of sewing. You're going to have to take your stitches out. Have a good seam ripper. Have a sharp one. Don't use an old one that's really old and dull and rusty. Go get a new one. They're not that expensive. This one is designed to be a lot easier to hold in your hand than the little thin ones that come in your kit or box. Totally worth it. Highly recommend having one that you can hold in your hand. As we get older, what we can hold changes. Bigger handles help us. When you use a seam ripper, if you didn't know, there's a sharp pointy end and there's an end with a little ball on it. You can use the ball against the fabric and slide through when you're undoing a seam, and that can make things go a lot faster. I'll admit I use razor blades or X-Acto knives for a lot of seam ripping because that's what I learned to use as a professional. But those make a lot of people nervous. Seam ripper is a safer bet. Also more useful if you're trying to take out serging. The bodkin. This is a super awesome tool. This tool is about this big. This enables you to take a tape or a cord and run it through, say, the waistband of the braids you've made. It's just a lot easier than a big safety pin. What it is it's a little jaw that will grasp onto that fiber or tape that you're going to run through, and you slide the little ring down to tighten that jaw, so it's holding it very tightly. Then you have a nice, sturdy 3.5-inch piece of steel that you can smoothly push through your waistband and get that tape through there. Locking bodkin, super useful little hand tool, which hopefully has had the same name for a really long time. Hemming. Okay, so we've made it all the way to the hem. We've made the garment, we've lined it, we've done all these things. What are we going to do for hems? Hems are where I really feel that machines come into their own. Step one is marking the hem. If you're making a floor-length garment, particularly, make really sure that you're doing this on a hard floor. Carpets or uneven floors are not a good plan for this. I also include here wearing the correct shoes and undergarments. This is incredibly important. Wear underneath this garment what you're going to wear in the successful final wearing of it. If that means that it's worn over a fitted kirtle, yeah, you got to put on the chemise and the fitted kirtle and wear the shoes you're going to wear. This comes up a lot in modern sewing. With my mom's profession, people would show up to have their bridesmaids dress fitted with a sports bra. Oh, I'm going to get a strapless bra. I'm not fitting the dress till you show up with the strapless bra and the shoes you're going to wear with it. This is incredibly important. It is remarkable how different our hems sit depending on where we have arranged the body underneath them. Wear the undergarment that is going to go with the garment. Really important. And the shoes, as much as you can, what you're going to wear with the garment. Fortunately, strapless bras and high heels are not a big thing in the SCA, but not every undergarment we have fits the same way. Your Tudor versus your 14th century things probably have fairly different fittings. Rolled hemming feet. Okay, so I found a good link to a short video on how the rolled hemming foot works, which is probably better than me trying to show you again on the machine, so that's why we've offered that. Rolled hemming feet are brilliant. It enables us to do that fine rolled hem. It's what I use on the bottom of my chemises or on the bottom of the lining of gowns or chemises. It literally rolls the hem over and top stitches it. I think you can see that. There's my little machined hem. My machine came with 3 different sizes of these feet. They do come in different sizes. Sometimes when you use them, you have to adjust your needle position to make sure that it is stitching down on it instead of missing it. It is a little tricky to use these. A few things you want to do before you roll hem all the way around your garment. You've marked the hem and probably you've cut it where you're planning, half inch longer than you wanted, so there's room for it to roll up. You want to then go over every single seam that you're going to sew over. That's, in my case, on a kirtle, each of the side gores, each of the center front and center back seams. You want to back stitch. That is, make sure that the stitching is double stitched at each point on there so it cannot fray open. You are then going to cut the seam allowance very, very close, almost an inch down. This will enable you to run that seam allowance through this rolled hemming foot. If you do not cut that seam allowance away and have that seam backstitched, it will come open or create a big lump and not go smoothly through the foot. Very useful to backstitch and trim your seams before you proceed with the rolled hemming. You do the rolled hemming with the face of the fabric down, the face is rolled up over, so you're working from the backside when you do it. It is a sort of tension game. The way I start rolled hemming is I put my foot down, I stitch forward and backwards, I lift the presser foot up, I pull it out, and then I use those strings from that back stitching as a cord to start pulling. Then I carefully place the material into the roll of the foot, and I use the knee lift to drop the presser foot back down while I'm holding the tension behind and the roll in the front, and then proceed to stitch forward slowly, making sure that just the right amount of the roll goes through. This all sounds pretty complicated, right? It's just a little bit of feeling and practice. So again, work on this with your scraps before you sew your garment. Do it on the chemise before you do it on the kirtle that's going to show. Get used to it, and it will save you hours and hours of time. Rolled hemming is totally your friend. You might need a little bit of practice. You don't want to pull too hard. You don't want to have it not move through enough. Do the practice. It pays off. Check out the videos. You can check out other videos. If you really want to, I will absolutely set up a time where I'll show you on my machines how they work.
I would also say another opportunity for practice is I will use the rolled hem foot when I'm going to be washing my linen, and I use it to secure the edge before I wash it. And shameless practice time.
Exactly. Where it just wouldn't matter if you messed it up.
That's right. And I do.
Blind hems. Okay. Blind hemming is really brilliant. It is really hard for me to show you, and this person made a video in under half a minute that also shows you how the overcast foot works. So totally use their link. It's better than what I could do. I don't know if we can view that while we're doing StreamYards. I'm going to just pick up my gown here. My red gown. Ooh, good. We're watching the video.
Well, we're going to see if we can. I don't know for sure.
We're exploring if we can watch the video. I'm going to go ahead and show this to them while I can. You don't see a lot of machine sewing showing there, do you? That's because this is a blind hemmed machined hem. What's all this dark material, you say? This is what I call junk facing. This was a lightweight wool that wasn't a wool. It was a polyester. I only bought a little of it to find out and found out it was not wool. However, what I did was I cut it into shape and used it to face the hem of my gown because it drags in the dirt. If you're going to drag something in the dirt, a fairly indestructible synthetic fiber that you don't love is a great choice. Then when this gets really worn out, I can replace it with another piece of fabric I did not care about, and my beautiful fine red wool gown still looks lovely and undamaged by all the ground I have dragged it over for 6 years. That's what the thing is. All right.
Did we want to see what happens? Hold on a moment here.
I don't think you need the audio with it.
Oh, okay.
They have captions. So they're using a version that has an electric screen that you touch for your needle position. That's him folding it over and pressing it to line it up. Putting the blind hemmer foot on, blind stitch foot. So what this does is that most of the stitches are on the hem, and 1 stitch every 5 stitches goes on the body side. This creates just a few stitches that hide really beautifully and don't show on the edge of your garment. It is the fastest way to hem your gowns and coats. It is brilliant. I recommend it highly. Again, it takes some practice. It takes a little bit of wrapping your head around it. On my machine, it has these different stitches on the top. That's what that last picture was. So when I do the blind hemming, I do move up to stitch 1. That is one of the only 2 times I have ever used all those other stitches on the Bernina. The other time was when I turned one of Willie's fighting shirts into his Dorothy of Oz costume. And I needed the embroidered detail stitching that's on the neckline in the movie, and I was able to copy that from one of my stitches on the Bernina. Otherwise, I use it for blind hemming, and I use the straight stitch and zigzag the rest of the time. Your mileage might vary, but that's some of what you can use those extra stitches for. Okay, junk facing. I already talked about that. That was that contrasting fabric. Hem marker. This is a modern tool. Obviously, it's not something I need on a gown that's going all the way to the ground or near the ground where marking at the floor and then measuring up from there is what you're going to do. But if you're measuring something like a man's coat that hangs low, this is super useful. It's kind of like a ruler on feet. It has this little adjustable metal thing you set to the right height. You clamp it over the fabric just lightly, and it lets you run the pin right through the fabric at the exact same height all the way around. This is how professionals mark hems when they're doing professional hems. It's not an expensive tool. It's often one you can find used and doesn't take up a ton of room. That's a hem marker. Okay.
You can also tie or tape a fabric marking pen onto a stool leg and very carefully twirl. I've heard.
Yes, they do make versions of these that had a little of chalk that you would mark yourself. You held the little bulb and marked for yourself. This is, again, look, we're part of a society of creative anachronism. There are other people who will help you with this. Don't try to mark your own hems. Somebody else will help you mark your hem. I swear. Ask around.
It was the pandemic and I was doing it in my office. A girl gets desperate.
Okay. You do the best you can, but really try to get help. It's just smarter. Okay. These are just 2 other feet that can do a cool thing that is worth mentioning. The cording or couching foot or the pin tuck foot can be used for this. The cording and couching one is the easier one because that foot has a little tiny hole in it that you can run a heavy piece of string. What I have used this for is when I have made tutus or gathered crinolines or had to gather a ton of fabric in one place. I don't recommend doing this for a gathered seam on a historic garment. I think there's better ways to do those. However, if you have a reason to gather up a ton of stuff, this is the machine hack for doing that. You use your heavy string that going through the middle. You set your machine at the widest zigzag and the longest stitch. You sew through your miles and miles of tulle that you're making in. And then you take it out, you anchor the thread at one end, and you pull it all down that thread, and a ton of fabric will gather onto it. This is much more efficient than just a basting stitch being pulled for gathering because it's actually a heavier string and it's zigzagged over, so there's more room to pull it off. As I said, if you don't have a quartering foot, but you do have a pin tuck foot, the pin tuck will work pretty well for holding that cord underneath as you're zigzagging over it and create the same effect. All right, it is 2 minutes to 12 and I covered the whole outline. I am now
brilliant.
Questions and other comments because we have made it on time.
We did have one question asking if you could show how to use a seam ripper. So some people seem to be able to just go and some of us get stuck.
Okay, let's see what I can do there. I've got the tool. Did some test seams yesterday. There should be some scraps around here. Okay. Okay. We can see thread stitching on white. So one way that you use a seam ripper is you use the sharp point to slide. I do this in front of the camera. To slide under a stitch. And when you push, that blade in the bottom lets you cut through the thread that way. So that's one way that you can pick individual stitches and cut them. Another way that you can use a seam ripper, and this is also something you can find other videos on the internet showing you how to do, that might have done a better job practicing doing it in front of a camera than I did, is you can similarly jab your sharp point in and push through like that. Got several stitches. If you're using the ball as your don't cut through here guide, you can push down on the threads you're cutting. This is really not easy to show. I hope that is helpful. I apologize that if it was not more, but I do know that there's some cool sewing hack videos out in the world that do show you better how to use a seam ripper, and we'll be able to address that a little better than I could.
We did have one other one here. Ruth says, I have an old Singer, 1950s or 60s, from my mother that didn't come with the toolbox. Do you have advice for trying to track down the tools, feet, etc.?
Yes, definitely try to find the manual to find out which feet are for your model. Your model number will help you find the manual online. Lots of dedicated sewists over the years have scanned their manuals and made those available. So if it's not on the Singer's webpage, you're going to find it on other people's web pages. I hope this has been a useful guide for what feet you might want to have. Same with the Singers that we had. I've never used it. So you probably don't need to find the pleater foot, but I bet you're going to want the zipper foot, the standard foot, and if they make a blind hem foot, you want to find that one. A better sewing machine shop is another way that should just help you find out what kind of feet work on your machine. A fair number of feet and machines were made relatively universally, where they made the same kind of foot work for many, many models of feet for years. Bernina's not one of those. The Bernina 830 needs the Bernina 830 foot feet, and they're expensive, but I have always been really glad I spent the money on them. But yeah, I have spent $60 on a machine foot and been grateful for it. Yes, I have. Oh, I didn't talk about even feet and walking feet, and that is actually a really useful thing to talk about. Did we have a picture of the walking foot? I'll grab it out of the drawer.
I don't remember seeing one.
Okay. So
In her defense, it's entirely possible that there was one in the collection of pictures.
No worries.
Missed it.
Okay. So what is even feed and walking feet? So most sewing machines, as I talked about, have a feed dog that feeds the fabric forward that's underneath the foot. And the foot goes up and down, but it doesn't do anything else. So all the pressure moving your fabric forward is underneath. It's on the bottom fabric. And sometimes that'll mean that your fabrics don't feed as well together as you'd like. What you can use then is an even feed or walking foot. The commercial machine that I use professionally is actually a dual walking foot. It has 2 feet and they move forward like this. This is why we don't pin anything when we sew upholstery fabric, because there's such good pressure, and the dual walking means it's evenly feeding the fabric through all the time. Most home machines don't have that feature, but they do make things that you can add on to your machine that will help. So this is one of those very expensive feet. This is the walking foot for the Bernina 830. It's the same type of part that fits on where the foot fits, but it has a foot that moves and walks. It also, like the buttonholer, has this part that has to fit over the needle screw, and that helps direct its movement because the needle goes up and down and it controls this part moving as well. This comes with a couple other feet and with a handy bar that you can use for set seam allowances. This gives you can set it to whatever seam allowance you need while you're sewing along with it. Super useful tool. Very useful for slippery fabrics. I will pause to say that if you are sewing velvet, particularly silk velvet, a walking foot is not enough. Pinning is not enough. You have to baste velvet. You have to hand baste it. And it's really a good idea to hand baste 2 lines of stitching before you machine sew velvet. Yes, velvet is that much trouble to sew. And yes, as an experienced professional, I advise you to do that. Sorry. Okay, so that's the even feet and walking foot. That's a useful thing to remember to include. Just to know what the words are so you can know what to look for your machine. You might not have the same machine I do, but figuring out what the words are for that, sometimes called a walking foot, sometimes called an even feed foot.
Sometimes called the "what on earth is this thing in the kit you bought me?" But yeah.
Yeah, but
now I know.
That one costs enough. Hopefully they'll make a big deal about it.
Well, that's wonderful. So we are at 12:06. I don't know if you wanted to go longer
I'm willing to answer any other questions that are lingering, but I imagine everybody else is tired of hearing me talk and ready to get on with their science. Obviously, feel free to message or write me if you have future questions, if you'd like to see these things in person. But I know there are other sewists around on tier in the known world who will help you out. And I hope this was an introduction to some tools maybe you didn't know about and was useful for some people.
Excellent.
Remind people where they can find her.
Oh, excuse me. Yes. So do we want to give out your email address, or how do you want people to contact you?
Let's just tell them to contact me. I think I am easily found on Facebook. I'm Maddie Dumont. Spike Zoetart, my SCA name is in parentheses, so if you put Spike, you'll probably find me. And that is a good way to reach me. I'll say it really quickly so it's not written on the internet, but my email address is baronessspike@gmail.com. No punctuation between it. That is 3 S's in a row. And I'm the only Baroness Spike apparently who wanted to be on Gmail. So feel free to write me that way. And thank you all for coming to listen. And I hope you have easy, happy, delightful sewing and wearing of your garb.
Thank you so much. I personally very much appreciate this class. There are several tricks that I plan to implement. So it has been a delight, as always, to listen to you and have you teach us new and wonderful things. So thank you very much. And I'm excited to see all the garb people come up with.
Have a great Sunday.
Thank you. You too.